So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this March EAA Virtual Accounting Research Seminars. We're very glad to be hosting Jan Babington from Lancaster University today. Before I introduce Jan, let me just remind you briefly about the rules of the seminar. The participants are kindly requested to stay muted during the seminar, but you can raise questions via the Zoom chat. Jen will talk uninterrupted for about 15 minutes and I will be monitoring the chat. And then when Jen takes the break, I will call on you to sort of speak directly to Jen and ask your questions. And then Jen will continue with her presentation, taking breaks from time to time. Jen Babington is Professor of Accounting and Sustainable Development at Lancaster University, where she's also the Director of the Pentland Center for Sustainability in Business. Her work has focused on issues that emerge at the intersection between sustainable development concerns and accounting scholarship. She has published quite widely, I would say, on sustainable development goals, sustainability science, motivation and rationales for sustainability reporting, carbon accounting, sustainability assessment, and even accounting education. Jen is also involved in a long-term collaboration between ecologists and sustainability scientists at the Stockholm's Resilience Center and the University of Stockholm, where she is essentially collaborating on a practice-based cohort of seafood company who are seeking to contribute to ocean stewardship, which is probably something she will also touch upon today with her talk. So the topic of the seminar today is corporate reporting on climate change, informing capital markets. Jen, the floor is all yours if you want to start sharing your screen and get started.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Giovanna. And thanks everyone for coming out. I always find this quite hard to find the spot because it's hidden under here. Get rid of that. Slideshow. Brilliant. Okay. Look, thank you so much for the opportunity to have a conversation around climate change reporting. And I'd like to make special thanks to Juliette Sen, who I know is on the call somewhere, to thank her because her and I did a lot of the empirical work at the core of this presentation together. And we're working on expanding that and doing a bit more with it at the moment. Regardless, it seemed like quite a nice time to be able to share, so basically a pilot study of that work, but also to talk more broadly about climate change, corporate reporting informing capital markets informing us as well as to how they're doing things. So that's primarily where I'm going to try to travel in the next while, a wee conversation about the global climate change landscape, so we know what we're setting our corporate analysis within. The corporate actors that I'm sort of going to focus on, because you've got the background brief, you can kind of see that this is aimed at a particular cohort of companies. And as Giovanna said, I'm part of a science team that's informing a CEO-led initiative that's got 10 seafood companies in it. And they're wishing to become stewards of the ocean, whatever that might mean, and it means many different things. One of the ways in which we work with them is that we pick up topics that they're concerned about, or we think they ought to be concerned about from a scientific perspective. We undertake some research and then we present that research to them. So what you have to read today is not a traditional academic paper, but it's a background brief designed for a chief exec that might only have, won't have a lot of time to read them. So they're pretty sharp and to the point, and trying to inform them of things that they need to understand in order to be able to think about their own reporting activities. At the same time, given the work that's gone into preparing that, we tend to then take some of that scientific advice and eventually turn it into an academic paper. So that's, if you like, why you've got a funny looking paper, just to see something different as well as to the kind of outputs that I certainly spend quite a bit of time producing as well. So this is really where I want to sort of try to situate the work that I'm presenting today into a much broader landscape. And sometimes, if you look at all these things, people are about to, I think, launch a great deal of research work into TCFD, which is sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth down this list. And because we tend to start our consideration of an academic subject with things that we're interested in, like providing information to a capital market, we might miss some of the other things in the landscape. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time just sort of playing out this landscape so you can see where my presentation today, which part of this landscape it fits into, but then also maybe the parts of a landscape that you're interested in that sit alongside that. So in the first instance, the International Panel on Climate Change and the NDCs, which stand for Nationally Determined Contributions, which are government statements about what they are going to do in response to climate change concerns, provides a strategic context in which all carbon accounting and accountability really needs to rest. The overall global desire is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. That will be quite tricky to achieve, but not entirely unachievable. And indeed, one of the great delights of the Biden administration is that the US is back into the Paris Agreement, and that mayors and cities and regions within the US were already doing a great deal of work in climate change terms. So they'll be coming back into that with actually a lot of work done under their belt. They're not starting from ground zero. It's probably worth pointing out that this whole strategic context is quite different from what it used to be under Kyoto. So previously there were agreements about what countries were to do, and people got allocated to being a high emission, medium or low emission country. And then you got a certain allowance for how many more emissions you're allowed to have. And then you organized your legislative program and ultimately your corporate governance down to the point of what you're allowed. That landscape's gone, partly because of the rows that it engendered, but partly because it was too rigid for what the world was trying to do. So the Paris Agreement is one where the overall goal's been agreed. How to get there, though, is a much more fluid process. In this respect, climate change governance is also the same as the Sustainable Development Goals. There's some sort of, sort of attractive and really strong statement about this is what we're trying to do. And then countries are invited to describe how they're going to contribute to that. And periodically what the IPCC does, it takes all the nationally determined contributions, adds them up and sees if it's enough. Currently, they've just done a big adding up process recently and it's not enough. So that's fed back out to the countries to search for more ways they could maybe pull carbon out of the system. So if we're thinking about that whole landscape part of it, that's basically the strategic context within which we might understand corporate action and corporate accountability. The next thing then is the RPCs. So these are the representative concentration pathways. So I'm going to pop onto the next slide because it's got some RPCs for us to be able to see. So these are the main RPCs. 2.6 means that we peak our emissions about now, or even better last year, and then they decline rapidly. Likewise, you've then got these other scenarios where you're likely to see a representative concentration of greenhouse gas pathways that will lead to a certain kind of average temperature increase by 2100. So these are really important for the overall scheme of thinking about carbon accounting because they provide the basis for the scenario analysis. So when you're making some plans or trying to plot away ahead as an individual company or a group of companies, that's the basis on which scenario analysis comes from. Then there's some really important and difficult translation tasks. So the first translation task is to take the scenarios and figure out what does that mean for corporate activity, wherever your corporate activity might be. Now, this is a hugely non-trivial task, but part of what I'm concentrating on today is how some companies are seeking to do that. You could think of that as a risk analysis. So from a corporation's perspective, what risks do they have from a particular outcome that might arise from greenhouse gas concentrations at a certain level. And as you'll see, many of the companies that we've been looking at in this sample are looking at arrays of risk analysis, so not just looking for a single point. And a lot of them use the RPCs to figure out what is it going to mean for them. It's then about translating that data into data that might be presented to stock exchanges, so some accounting and reporting of various sorts. A really big player in that translation process is, of course, the Carbon Disclosure Project, but there are many other translators in that process. You know, the national rules about how you take an activity, you turn it into CO2, the kind of things that you might be responsible for, particularly the Scope 3 emissions that come not from your direct operations, but from elsewhere in the supply chain and the value chain that you contribute to. And if you like, a lot of accounting and reporting activity happens in that particular space there, and thinking about how do companies provide financial as well as physical accounts about their carbon impacts. Of course, the next level of translation, which is really being tackled at the moment, and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is really sound in its conception, really sound in its ambition, but the execution of that part of the links in this chain at the moment are not very good. But they will improve as people, you know, learn how to you know, produce that information and to use that information. So this is where you might translate the accounting and entity level descriptions through into capital market decision making. And so participants in the capital markets want to know, you know, what kind of risk am I buying into when I buy a company? And then the TCFD helps them do that. And then the final link, which is a link that's only just starting to emerge. And I don't know if any of you have been looking at the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations yet. They're a really interesting set of disclosure regulations that came into play, well, the first lot came into play end of March this year. And then there's a rolling program of things going out the way from it. So this is a requirement on the, it comes out of the financial products regulation process. And so that regulatory group is worried about investors representing this as a sustainable index or a sustainable bond, or you know, invest in this cohort of companies and you'll be doing sustainability stuff. So this is coming from that worry about how financial institutions might communicate their exposure to environmental risks. And they're focusing on, you know, as you can imagine, on climate change. And so there's a requirement that you take your financial products and you separate them out into kind of products that they are, whether or not they have, you know, no you know, sustainability elements to them, whether or not they have, you know, some, or whether or not they're fully built off sustainability requirements. And there is an EU taxonomy that's coming together about defining what a sustainable business is. And there's different taxonomies and categories of this. And that won't be required until you know, sometime in 2022, that those requirements will come into play. 1st of January 2022. So we haven't actually seen those obligations yet, but there's a sense of that they're coming and what they're going to be. So this is an EU regulatory framework, but the UK regulatory bodies have said financially they're going to align with it as well. So that, if you like, is the landscape within which we might think about carbon accounting. I'm going to look at just 2 of these, and I'll show you which 2 when we come on to that. But I wanted us to be clear as a group of that wider set of places where these things might happen. Now, I'm slightly shy of the 15 minutes, but I'm now about to go into a flow of something else. So I'm quite happy to pause here and take any questions, partly because this landscape might also be interesting to people on the call as well. So Giovanna, I shall pause.
Yes, thank you, Jen. As of now, there are no questions in the chat. I don't know if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. Otherwise, we can go on and take more later.
I'm quite happy to proceed.
I would like to ask a question, if I may.
Of course.
Um,
Hi,
I
Torsten.
need to put my video on. Hi, my name is Torsten. Hi, Jay. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your talk. When you outlined this whole regulatory framework, may I ask about your opinion regarding its ultimate goal? Is this primarily about informing capital market participants in the sense of capital markets regulation, level information, playing field, the kind of logic that underlies IFRS, for example? Or is this ultimately what we can refer to as targeted transparency? So transparency regulation with the goal of getting companies to change and reduce their carbon footprint and stop exacerbating climate change.
Partly, I am led to believe that it's the latter, particularly the sustainable finance disclosure regulations. So whilst I think clearly the standard setters are hoping that this will also inform, sort of more mainstream accounting processes, it is explicitly designed to enter that non-financial reporting category, so that you can start to see with more robust and consistent metrics the story of what's happening from a carbon perspective on both firms and the risks that they're translating into markets, but also markets and funds themselves and the risks associated with them. And I'm slightly hesitant about knowing how that would play through, because this is really, really new disclosure regulations, but they are also ones, if you like, that are trying to provide some climate transparency around the whole of the capital markets. Now, what happens next with that in a couple of years when they start coming through, and if national determined contributions change at the same time, I think there is some hope that these things will connect together, crystallize, and take us to this, whatever the brave new world is going to be. I'm personally not going to hold my breath, but I'm keen to have a go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen. There is Charles that may also have a question.
Yes, hi, Jen. Nice to see you again.
Hey.
To take a broader question, I always wonder what was your view on the role of those big COP agreements, Paris, for example, or the ones before or after, UN SDGs being those very macro level that speaks to a lot of people, and the link that we're making to our own discipline as accounting and reporting, like how effective those are and where do they fit? Because we refer to those a lot, because it speaks to people who are not in accounting and not even maybe necessarily interested in climate change, but okay, well, this is a big thing because a lot of countries agree on this. The US pulling out and coming back, it was a big deal. How do we, because that first slide is very nice because you really put a whole landscape as you mentioned, but I was just wondering what was your view of the connection between our own specific disciplines such as accounting and reporting?
They certainly nest down the way. So the COP agreements and the SDGs are, from a governmental perspective, non-negotiable. Everyone signed up to them, and ultimately it's the only game in town if you want to have a biosphere that hangs together enough for human well-being. So I think people are quite clear about that. How they're then translated through a national level to the context within which organisations operate, and then from there it's an easier step down to the accounting. There's also then various markets that are developed in order to be able to achieve those goals, and the emission trading schemes would be a really good example of that. And then the extent to which the standards, accounting standards, were unable to follow that particular innovation, which Carlos Larrinaga and myself have written about before. And so, if you like, there wasn't a full translation through from the carbon markets through to reporting that would really allow people to use that. So I see them as the link through in quite a clear way of governance. I suppose my frustration sometimes is that people talk about these high-level things and then they go down to a bunch of reporting, and actually it's the things in between that also maybe attention has to be focused on as well. these things keep on getting bigger. So until about a year ago, we only had the first 4 bullet points. We're now up to 6. I think there is a world a carbon-based set of governance that takes us all the way through. And that's now just coming into being. And so I think that's really quite important for translating those obligations that countries have entered into through international legal processes. And it's worth noting, of course, that the US had to leave it. They couldn't just ignore it. They either had to stay in or they had to leave. So in that respect, they're binding agreements at an international level, and then it cascades all the way down and through various institutions, including, I haven't put like stock exchanges in here, but stock exchanges and how they choose to list and how they choose to govern risk will sit within this landscape as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, you did. He's saying yes. Okay, Jen, I think you can go on and
Onward
we'll take, yeah, thank you.
No worries. Right, let's keep on going then. So you've seen this, so we've already dealt with that. But okay, so what I want to do now is just to do a quick detour into science so you can understand particularly the science for the seafood companies, which will help you understand why the sample set that we've chosen, but also, if you like, the issues that arise through climate change in the ocean is replicated on land-based industries as well. And indeed, it's quite hard to separate land-based agricultural sector and sea-based agricultural sector because they feed materials back and forth to each other in quite a regular fashion as well. So this slide is really just to show you the ocean anomalies that will come through in different places if we go for the most hopeful scenario, which is the 2.6, and the most unhopeful scenario, which is the 8.5 for the climate anomalies. Here it's really clear that while we might have global climate change, it doesn't happen in the same way in the same places in the whole time. So if you are operating on the ocean, as the CBOS companies are operating on the ocean, then they will have to face these long run trends, and they'll be building scenarios about what their fishing effort could and should look like between those two trends. You also see, which you kind of know, is it's an average warming. In some places it's a cooling. So certainly the North Atlantic starts to cool in these longer term scenarios because of the weakening of the Gulf Stream. So I think you can look at these. You definitely don't want 8.5. Okay, I think that's a fairly clear message. So it's then thinking about risk assessment towards that. They're long run figures. At the same time, there are also historic ocean heating effects going on. So these are hotspot analysis where for a relatively short period of time, the ocean heats up and either sometimes causes, sometimes doesn't cause fishing losses. So for the seafood companies, they'd be interested if, for example, they're operating in this region here, then they'll be interested in thinking, well, what species are going on there, being fished there? And if we get an El Nino, because this is an El Nino effect, then we might anticipate some fisheries losses and losses of productivity. So if I want to make a risk assessment for myself as a company and communicate it to stock markets or to other users, then I'll need some probability estimates of what might happen here with regard to hotspots effects. And so hotspots, this is quite technical science. There's a whole big groups of people who are trying to model this in a way that will provide information for decision makers. And through to terrible, more terrible and worse. This is the last sort of science slide that I'll give you, and then we'll get it back onto more accounting ground. So this is again showing some of the scenarios that corporations are drawing from in order to be able to articulate the effects they might be seeing. So this is fishing with climate risk, the status quo, approach to fisheries at RPC 2.6. So this is a fishing effort assumption and a climate change assumption joined together to see what happens. So this is sort of like where we are at the moment to a certain extent. Then there's some options that if you keep the same fishing approach, but you assume that climate risk goes to the RPC 8.5, this is what happens to the ocean in terms of this is a heating index, and basically anything, if you start mucking around with this, fish do swim, of course, so it makes them more mobile than land-based creatures, but they don't swim so far as to be able to escape some of this. But also when they do swim, their ecosystem might not move with them, so they might be able to swim away, but they can't eat. So you've got this going on. This is then a fishing climate risk on the same scenario as this, but with a more sustainable fisheries policy and approach. So you can see now we're trying to help the firms be able to carve out what comes about, what is a climate background risk, and what might be a fishing effort amelioration risk. And so things sort of improve a bit, but some places are still pretty tough to be. So it depends if you're fishing in those particular areas. And then the final one, which is here, is making, this is again to sort of spread out some of the cases. This is a worst case, so it's very high warming and it's overfishing. Basically at this stage you've collapsed global fish stocks. So these kind of scenario analyses are scientifically determined. I certainly can't produce them. I can only, I'm not taking on trust, I'm taking on peer-reviewed publication trust that these work. And these are the basis from which organisations are seeking then to communicate their risk to external stakeholders. So if we go back to that landscape, it's in these two places, if you like, where the analysis starts. So the scenario analysis and the communication of that, and then how that is that's translated into risks with regard to corporate activity. And so this is where our research sits, is within those two categories in the context of that broader scientific picture. So what do we do? Given the purpose of the briefing that you've got, and for us this ends up our sort of pilot study for a larger study, is that what we were trying to do is we're trying to communicate to our fisheries firm what companies who are in sectors who are equally reliant on the natural ecosystem believe is going to happen. And so this is a really important move in perspective. So previously, we might anticipate that most people think about, well, what is my impact? This is not an impact account. This is a dependency account. So how are you dependent on the natural ecosystem to be able to carry on operating at the agricultural sector and the food and drink sector? Because at the end of the day, those products rest somewhere in the natural world. To get our pilot group, what we did is we had a look at companies that are deemed to be critical to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is drawn from the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is based in the Netherlands, but draws together cohorts of what they call keystone companies that will have a large outcome on some of those broader policy objectives. So for those of you who might follow the seafood work that I'm involved in, it's a keystone cohort. So that idea of building a keystone has also influenced the World Benchmarking Alliance. So they've gathered together 2,000 companies across the world that they believe will be most important for SDG achievement. And they base that around systems transformations that we will need to achieve those goals, whether it be a social transformation, decarbonising, circular economy type translations, digital transformation, agriculture and food transformation, and then their final category is urban and financial systems transformations. So this is a really interesting data set, and that they're in the process of benchmarking a lot of them as to how well they do. And so it's again a natural and social outcome-based company set, not united by country of incorporation or size or the availability of data in some sort of spreadsheet package. So we took all of the world benchmarking companies who are in the food and drink and agricultural sector, and then we further reduced them down by companies that have a very high degree of maturity in their carbon disclosure project reporting. So the CDP define different levels of reporting. Category A, and these are the category A companies, have a high degree of maturity, and they've obtained good results in climate change terms. Category B companies, well, they've recognised the importance. They're following the leading companies and doing all right. Category C is, yeah, they've got some things I've implemented. So the CDP produces this sort of structuring, if you like. The CDP also asks investors to fill in hugely extensive questionnaires. And we've drawn on those questionnaires to create the analysis that we've undertaken. It was not cheap to acquire this data, so you do have to pay to get a hold of it, but it's interesting because, if you like, it's that private information flow from corporations to capital markets mediated through the CDP. It's also the case that some of that information is in standalone reports, but actually there's more information in the CDP data set. A company can say that it won't release that data through the CDP, in which case you don't get it, but most companies do. So sometimes you might have gaps, but there's not that many gaps. So using that approach, and this is where, Juliet, don't worry, don't ask Juliet any questions. She'll be sitting there horrified at that prospect. I will answer the questions, but this is the work we did together. So I want to make sure that it's not just me involved in this work. So in order to, the questions we were interested in, because the questionnaires are huge, but we wanted to look at three things. Firstly, what dependencies were people articulating in functional ecosystems? So how did their revenue and operations depend on the ecosystems being sound and not being adversely affected by climate change? The second thing that we were interested in is what kind of climate change scenarios were they using to actually be able to provide information, and then what emissions reductions were they seeking to obtain. And this is partly, we focused on these because these were the things that we were wanting to inform our companies and CBOS about. But also, if you like, it sort of questions that you don't see the answers to very much in our literature, except for maybe the emissions reductions. So our literature hasn't really addressed the dependency question yet. So we were quite keen to do that. The 22 companies have a series of incorporations in quite different places. In some ways, this was quite helpful for us because they mirrored quite a lot of where the seafood companies are headquartered. So in terms of the European companies, a lot of these companies are headquartered in Switzerland. It's a very big food producing companies are based there, but there are other companies in Europe as well. And also there were a lot in Japan, because again, that's a really big food generating cohort of companies. And again, this is a point of difference between some of the data we might see in environmental accounting that might be across company, but it's like all big companies across different countries, whereas this is large corporations that have who are very good at explaining climate change regardless of where they're headquartered. So certainly where they're headquartered and how they communicate, what kind of governance regimes are under, will provide some noise to this. But in some ways we would argue, particularly on climate change and the CDP, there's almost like this sort of like a global data requirement, because it's the same questionnaire that gets sent everywhere. So moving on to what this shows us. Some really interesting dependency data. So this is sort of quite hard to understand from the CDP questionnaire, because it's not like 80% of causes income is reliant on barley, but it's for a particular agricultural commodity, the revenue associated with that. So in beer, for example, if you don't have barley, you're not going to have beer. And so they've got a very high dependency on that. And you can see there's a whole variety of commodities significant to the different businesses. For some of the businesses, more than one commodity is really hugely important for their natural dependencies. The other thing to say, though, as well, is, which I find quite interesting, is that if you run down those commodities, in many of these areas, or not in all of them, there are business associations and roundtables that have assembled together to try to improve the operations in a way that might be sustainable. So I'm particularly looking at palm oil. So the round table on sustainability and palm oil will be quite an interesting one. So in the background of all of these, there will be industry associations and dedicated sustainability commodity activities going on to try to underpin those agricultural products in a changing environmental conditions, whether that be, in this case, climate change, but also soil, through to availability of nutrients, through to weeds and pests in particular. So as the climate warms up, different pests are going to enter different parts of the ecosystem. So we haven't played it out in this presentation, but there's a really interesting corporate normativity question in all of these areas. They're being informed by other sets of norms as well. In terms of what can we take from that pattern, is that there are high levels of dependencies across this array of commodities. Those commodities are linked to activities, so it should be no surprising that the seafood company in there is really dependent on fish. At the same time, it's also worth realizing that commodities and food chains move back and forth between what you might think of as the ultimate products. So if you're raising salmon, you're also heavily reliant on sugar, soy, and wheat. Likewise, anchovies in particular and fish oils are used in pork feed products. So, I mean, if you ever want to never eat meat again, talk to me and I can tell you more about these product chains. So what you've got is this weaving of base raw materials that end up in then a whole nother array of final food products. So even if you feel like, well, I'm only interested in fish and the fish are okay, in which case I'm not carrying risk, you will be carrying risk because there's risk in other commodity sectors. So that means that any modelling that you might undertake as an individual company about where your risk lies already is starting to look pretty complicated. And some of this data on this modelling approach will come from industry associations. So they're really important in trying to articulate these links coming through, as well as the kind of risks that you might calculate as an organisation in your own right. And many of the organisations, certainly that we're working with in the seafood context, have their own science advisory groups and scientists that they employ as a matter of course. Likewise, all of those raw material commodities will have scientific expertise, probably sitting in an industry association level. So a lot of science comes into this, which then eventually makes its way through to the data that we might be more interested in as accountants. In terms of, so dependencies are definitely there. This introduces risk into supply chains as well as direct operations of agricultural companies. In terms of the kind of scenarios that people are using, and this is where I have to say that, I mean, both Juliet and I thought that we would find virtually nothing of interest, and we were very, very pleased to be entirely wrong in that particular context. So what we have here is a summary of the scenarios that are being used by the 22 companies that we analysed, and scenarios split into two sorts. And if you're following TCFD, you'll recognise the labels here. So transitional scenarios are changing and operating conditions that are likely to emerge for companies that arise from a changing policy context. So that's what the transitional scenarios are. And there's several of them, of which some are used here. Physical scenarios are going back to those ones that we looked at in the first few slides. So this is the concentration pathways scenarios, and companies are using those as well. And some of them are really interesting. So some companies are using 2.6 and 8.5 to get a range are used quite common. And other ones are looking at transitional scenarios and physical scenarios. Now, the thing with the physical scenarios is that physical scenarios create transitional scenarios, because if a risk is there, then the legal regime within which people are operating is also there. But there will be different time scales on the two sets of scenarios. So what we concluded from this is that that companies are using scenarios. They're using them to inform quite concrete and far-ranging activities. And some of them are in box number 2 in the briefing that you had, but I'm quite happy to, if you read it, well and good, but if you haven't, because if you're like me, you would have run out of time before you got there, I'll just sort of give you some idea about what they're looking at. So for a cocoa producer, for example, they are using the best and worst scenario, looking overall to the middle to the end of the century. So these are quite long-term timeframes they're looking at. And the reason for looking at that timeframe is cocoa farming is a long-term business that requires planning over several decades. That is, you can't suddenly bring into production a whole bunch of cocoa. It has to have been planned and planted and nurtured over a period of time. So this particular company operates globally and is most exposed to physical risks due to climate change rather than transitional risks. So for these guys, it's what's happening on the ground. And what they're doing is that they are trying to formulate a carbon strategy, which is to become carbon positive by 2025, which goes well beyond a 2-degree pathway, because I've realized that if you get any more than that, it's going to completely wreck their base product supply, which in their case is cocoa. Other people are looking to extend their analysis over the whole life cycle of the product, even though they might not grow it. If they're just buying it off markets and commodity markets, they know those prices will change. So they're looking to provide a cradle to a grave support across the whole piece. That might include new plantings. It might include developing strains of plants and animals that are resistant to environmental stress of various sorts, etc., etc. So it was quite interesting to us that organisations in this data set were providing quite holistic solutions, but also long-term solutions. And again, one of the reasons why we found that quite interesting is that there's sort of like this narrative, well, companies are, they're greedy, they're nasty, they're into the short term, they never look long term. These companies are looking long term. And so it might be that they are in this group A, so they're the more proactive, or maybe more proactive at communicating what's going on. Others might be proactive and not saying anything. But also that if you're in agriculture, you can't sort of necessarily only think about the short term. Now, what kind of contracts they have for buying what kind of agricultural products are probably quite short term and really very market orientated, but simultaneously there's this much longer view that's evident from the data that we gathered as well. On the final sort of category of things that we looked at, and I'm getting near the end, so in that respect, we might have a bit more time for questions. We looked at the reduction targets that they were approaching. Many of them had absolute reduction targets compared to relative. Now, the difference between the two, a relative production target would be the amount of CO2 emitted per tonne of fish raised in an agricultural setting, if you like. But absolute reductions is regardless of what you're doing with the volume of your production, your carbon footprint is reducing. So most of these firms had absolute reductions in the pipeline. And I think that's quite different from maybe, the last time I looked at these in any depth, maybe, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of the target setting was relative. This suggests there might have been a move to absolute reductions as the science and as the tightening of the governance process, international governance regimes tightened up as well. These firms all had near-term and long-term targets, so they were offering, perhaps some certainty about their near-term, some longer-term targets as well. And interestingly, many of them included Scope 3. There's only 1 or 2 that didn't have Scope 3 in their set. This means that they are setting targets about emissions about which they don't own the operating assets that are creating those emissions, and they don't have direct control over them. That means to me that they must have some relationship which allows them to believe that they could help influence the Scope 3 targets. And then some of them were signing up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a particular way of going about your target setting, and then you get the stamp of approval from the Science Based Target Initiative people, where other ones were generally using science as a basis for their targets. So we try to sort of keep those two things separately because they're not entirely the same thing. But I also like to say these are the best guys. So these are the 22 most proactive companies in this space. And what Juliet and I are doing now is looking at Group B and Group C to see whether or not how far ahead this early cohort is, and where is the next leading cohort going to. This is a way of graphing those ambitions. So we've done it against reducing percentage reduction each year on the vertical axis, which was slightly on top of each other, against total greenhouse gas reduction that they're seeking. And it's really hard to know what to make of this. I mean, it's a plot. So it's quite interesting where some people are. So there are some folk who are thought to be very good. Nestle would be one of them. Danone would be another one. They are sort of middle of the pack here, but it might be that having been proactive in the past, they are now in this sort of middle of the pack kind of area. So it does depend where you started and where you're going to as to where you end up here. So, these guys have only started recently, so they've got a lot of catching up to do. So they've got quite, high, relative targets. But it's interesting. There is an array of different things going on. And I think the thing that really struck me as well, and partly because we knew this from the seafood side of things as well, is the predominance of Japanese companies. So the Japanese approach and the Japanese companies really matter in this data set. And it's quite interesting because if I think about some of the studies that we might see in more mainstream environmental accounting approaches, it might be US data or UK data, but that suggests there might be quite a lot of activity that's going on that's lost from our literature because it's not a sort of like a standard data set that we might be interested in. So again, it sort of really plays to the diversity of data, might help enormously. So to close, right, for the pilot study, we think these guys, we've got a leading edge of corporate responsiveness that was certainly much better than I thought it would be. It was quite a cheerful moment when I realised what these guys were up to. And also it suggests that it's changing rapidly. So we'd certainly be interested in seeing how these emerge, how these companies develop their performance over the next few years. There is this scenario link that's going on. And of course, that whole scenario link is also sitting behind the TCFD. So that's perhaps not a surprise. But this was data from about a year and a half ago. So they were ahead of maybe our awareness of TCFD coming into play. The whole impacts dependency piece, particularly interesting to see the dependencies being highlighted. They are also highlighted as being financially material. So if people try to talk you into the fact, well, it's an add-on, it doesn't really matter, I think you can say to them, it does matter. It is financially material to organisations' activities. And these targets are becoming more science-based with or without links to that particular science-based targets initiative. This also speaks to something that's been hanging around our field for a bit, but has never really gained much traction that I've seen in the literature, and that is the idea of context-based sustainability reporting. This is context-based. So to close with my last slide, and what might this imply for accounting research? I hope that you have seen something new. I hope you've seen something, a bit exciting in terms of things emerging into the space that's better than you might have anticipated. And I guess, one of the challenges that I had was realizing that of trying to draw out this array. So there's no magic to this array of bullet points, but it's my attempt to sort of really highlight when you talk about carbon accounting, it operates at all these levels, with that last bullet point being a level that's only just starting to emerge into the policy domain now. And so I'd encourage, there's plenty of interesting things in all of these layers and across all of these pieces. So Giovanna, I'm back in your careful hands.
Yeah, I will ask a question while the audience think about theirs. And it's in particular about the fact that these companies are, sort of realizing this impact and dependencies are financial materials. But was there any evidence that they would account for this in their financial statements?
We didn't do the link back to look at their financial statements. I guess this is much more prospective and them communicating future prospects and future risks. Over time, the implications of what kind of concentration pathway we're on will come through to their financial statements in due course. But they weren't, for example, setting up future climate change liabilities or anything like that. So there wasn't like a shadow financial reporting stream of data that would sit alongside the main accounts that reflect some of this. So this is, I suppose it's part of the non-financial reporting and disclosure that you might see that would provide a greater context and understanding of the core financial statements themselves.
And just to follow up, so this disclosure were essentially reported to the CDP. And in a sense, if you don't have access to the CDP, you may or not see this information. Did you check at all whether these companies are in fact also disclosing in public documents these information?
Yeah, for some of them they are, and indeed, and sometimes, and this is where I'm leading on Juliet's explanation of it, and sometimes their disclosure outside of a CDP is bigger and fatter and more nuanced than what's in the CDP. So the CDP has a structured questionnaire. So the upside of that is that, if you like, it comes in the categories that they ask. Sometimes that might be the extent of your information. Sometimes there's more information elsewhere as well. But I guess from her and my perspective, the systematic nature of seeing it in CDP then led you to other information sources that helped. So like the Science Based Target Initiative has information about who signed up to them and what have they signed up to. So there is sort of, there's the company's own reports, their standalone reports, CDP, and other information produced for other purposes as well. So all of these places are parts of the puzzle, if you like.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions?
Yes, may I say something?
Yes, of course,
Giovanna?
Begonia. Yes,
Thank
please.
you, Giovanna.
Sure.
I was going to type it, but well, I want to follow in your question about the financial materiality. I was a bit surprised with this last comment that Jan made about the financial materiality of these dependencies or risks, because if that's the case, then there are reasons to consider them as part of the financial reporting. And to my understanding, well, this is not the case so far. So why do you think that this is important, that they are financial material or not? Or is that because you are focusing on the outside in perspective and you don't consider the other perspective that makes things that may be non-financial material for the company, but material for someone else should be disclosed? So I was a bit surprised with this last comment on the materiality from the financial perspective in this context. Thank you.
Because it's future orientated, and they're saying that should these risks crystallize, these will be financially material for us. I would assume that investors and analysts on the stock market are taking that data and translating it through to preferences about, buy, sell, hold kind of decisions and what valuation they feel. So in that respect, I don't see I can't see how it would enter the financial statements because it's a future orientation, scenario kind of thing. But I would expect that to be impounded in some way into the stock market price, should the stock market be capable of doing so. Now, I think it's an open question whether or not stock market analysts are capable of translating that data and bringing it forward. I think they certainly must be capable of doing so. The CDP has certainly spent a great deal of time articulating how to do that and providing information. So there's information intermediaries in the process to be able to bring that information to market. it might be that the materiality of that to stock valuation is increasing over time. And I could certainly see that being the case. So it might be that, and again, this is a leading edge cohort, if you like. It might be that this is an indication of what will flow through in the next 3 to 4 years. But we haven't done the analysis of group B and C yet. But if their disclosures are quite different, then that would suggest to me that this is the leading edge, and we might see some co-development of that reporting, not the financial statements, but about the future, and then stock valuation might emerge from that in due course. But you can also imagine, some really cleverly designed event studies to try to look at, whether or not, monsoons with disruption to cocoa supply plantations and changes in commodity prices lead to changes in corporate valuation. That would be a way, which is well beyond my skills, but that would be a way of actually ascertaining whether or not those connections are there in an implied sense. We just haven't had the right kind of lens to see them and to see if they're there or not.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Jan.
Thorsten, do you want to go next?
Yes, please. Thank you. I want to follow up on Giovanna's question about, this discussion at the IASB. To what extent should climate-related information, should climate-related matters be covered in the financial statements proper, including the notes, already under current standards? And you said you didn't see, in your study at least, in those firms, anything in the financial statements, but one other area in which we could see those effects would be in companies' earnings guidance or other management forecasts. I mean, if companies provide only EPS forecasts 1 year out, there probably wouldn't be much, since you're talking about long-term effects. But first question would be, did you see any of that being used in management forecasts? And secondly, from your perspective, would you advocate that IFRS reporting, financial reporting, should be developed into a direction that would allow these effects, these forecasts to be captured in the financial statements in the form of provisions, or expanding the notion of impairment, things like that?
I should backtrack a wee bit. We didn't do a systematic analysis of the financial statements, but you've now inserted that in my mind. So my co-authors will be groaning at that particular portion, but I think it's a good proposition. Likewise, we haven't looked at the company's earning guidance and earnings forecasts, but I would hope that this presentation might prompt people who do that work and know how to do it and interested in doing it, that there might be something to see in there now going forward. So hopefully, if that is your style of things that you're interested in, then maybe this will give you some it's worth a look around and see what's happening out there. In terms of the IFRS reporting and those sorts of things, there you just opened a great big bear trap. Would you like to step into that? I admire your question. I'm quite torn, because if we try to bring this this kind of insight into rules that are too narrow, then I think we would lose it. So at the moment, to a certain extent, and I hope that my presentation suggests this to you, there are parallel processes in play here. And the valuable thing might be that to have these parallel processes, and at some stage there'd be a translation point from one to the other. I would have said until now, because as I said a couple of times in the presentation, I was surprised by how good this reporting was. To now, I think there's been parallel processes and no ability to translate from one to the other. I think it's now an open question of whether or not that translation is happening in any event. And if a translation is happening, it does raise the prospect that one might fold into the other. But if you folded it in too soon, and if you were too narrow in your approach to valuation and reporting, then you might lose a lot of the subtlety in the data that is clearly bringing something to the market at the moment. So I think it's a tricky answer to that. And the trouble is that if you fold these two things in too early and you lose a whole lot of fidelity of both the financial data and the other data, or if you make it all reducible to one kind of data set, you again might lose information fidelity. But I think that's quite an open question, and one that would be interesting to try to work out empirically how you would investigate that without actually undertaking that change in regulation. The trustees' proposal that they should become the guardian of sustainability reporting, and they were going to start with climate change. I was reasonably, well, it's in the public record, I was reasonably unconvinced by that without a series of other things needing to be in place simultaneously, like ecological literacy, etc., etc. And I think the worry I have about the climate first approach is that there's a great deal of other stuff going on as well that we might want to deal with. And so I think one of the things from the science, particularly for the seafood companies, and I guess I'm more enmeshed in the science for that, is you've got a climate biology intersection of risk that creates quite different outcomes. And for all agricultural firms, I would imagine you'd have that sort of natural capital and climate change intersection. And it might be too soon to proxy all of that with climate. But yeah, but it is, that's an opinion. It's not research informed, but it would be nice to see how you might bring a research informed perspective on that.
I mean, you did look at voluntary disclosures here, right? And if we make some stuff mandatory, that doesn't mean that it has to necessarily crowd out voluntary information that will add nuance and richness to information to the markets.
Yeah, and I, if you're following the kind of things that Carlos Larranaga and I write, that whole voluntary mandatory is quite a blurred line. I don't know if CDP is technically it's voluntary, but it might be pseudo mandatory. So I think there's a continuum in there as well. I was quite impressed by the number of companies in that set for whom, there weren't very many that we lacked the data for. So they could voluntarily or not report to CDP, and then they can say, well, I've reported to you, but no one else can have the data. But relatively few did that last step. Some of them, got sent the questionnaire and didn't report as well. So I think that voluntary mandatory is a bit of a fuzzy category, but an interesting category because of that.
Thank you.
Charles, do you want to go next?
Yes, thanks. I had a question about maybe some more elaboration about the targets you mentioned, the relative versus absolute, which is a bit of something I just sometimes think about. Not only just, you mentioned the context-based relative versus absolute, but also how are these how are they held accountable if they don't meet them? And another question I didn't put on the chat was comparability methodology and also these long-term horizon target. So like 2050, we're going to be net zero. I mean, that's sort of the big buzzword, caricatural, but how are these playing into account in terms of accountability when targets are not met? I mean, that doesn't have to be from your study per se, but I'm just asking maybe as a general because we talked about the target earlier. So
I think there's a management accounting question in there as to the extent to which these targets are agreed by the board and whether or not the company is meeting those targets. That again would be an empirical question as to whether or not these are to the board level internal targets and what kind of reporting mechanisms sit around them. In terms of comparability, if they disclose the methods by which they're gathering the data, then there might be some comparability. But again, I'd imagine it'd be quite noisy because there's quite a lot of noise in the World Resources Institute greenhouse gas reporting protocol. Now that noisiness is reducing over time as that's refined and people are, if you like, centering around some similar rules. But there will always be noisiness in that. Even things like average emission factors for electricity grids in each country, they're quite noisy data. So it'll be noisy and a bit fuzzy, but it's probably not it shouldn't be factors of difference and correct. You're right. Net zero by 2050. Isn't that an interesting question? I'm about to commission a rapid review here at Lancaster for somebody to tell me what that means, because I wish I knew. It's language that's now there, and it's being articulated and adopted by all sorts of institutions and countries and whatnot. And I think it means an array of things, but that's a hugely interesting question.
I mean, it's just it relates to the accountability, because we're looking at 30 years down the road, and these people who have set the targets, they're not going to be around most likely. No accountability. So, they keep pushing those dates. Even the SDGs was supposed to be done in whatever 2030. I bet you when it got 2027, well, now SDG will be for 2050, and then we keep pushing. So this is sort of a target as well.
Yeah,
right?
but I disagree with that, because you've then got quite an atomistic view of whose the target is. So if it's the corporation's target and they've undertaken that for the board, it's not about somebody being there or not being there. But likewise, climate change acts that I've seen in both in the UK and Scotland, they're written by politicians that won't be there on the date that it crystallises, and then they get periodically rewritten and strengthened, in both the UK cases, strengthened into tighter targets because people met them earlier in time. So I think there's a level of cynicism about, oh, well, these targets will never be met. But the Millennium Development Goals were met. The SDGs were built explicitly off the back of that. So there is of course there'll be slippage in some places, but a lot of these targets are met. And I know that there's a narrative around, oh, no one will ever do this, but I always wonder, what interest does it serve to believe that is the case? Because empirically, it can be demonstrated that it's not the case in many instances. I think it would suit some interest for that to be the case, but it's not. And I'd move it away from the individual manager, because these are institutional targets. It's not manager X decided, let's have it.
Thank you.
Be more cheerful, Charles.
Monomita, would you like to turn on the mic and ask your question?
Hi, sorry. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Hi, Jen. Thank you for your nice presentation. So when I'm using the CPD data, like it says that it encourages companies to assess the relevance of the questions in accordance with the principles of the greenhouse gas protocol. So according to these principles, if the information is relevant for internal and external stakeholders, then only they should report that. Now, like if I go with this principle, then there could be many cases where the companies would not be interested to report them properly through CPD. So if I'm doing like big data analysis, so what is your suggestion that how I can fix those missing information, and how I can generalize my findings, saying that whatever I'm finding, say, for example, I'm taking all the questions and I'm analyzing a good framework or a policy for the companies to follow. So how this missing observations or this methodological restriction would restrict my findings to generalize for other cases?
Yeah. I think that, I'm not, in the kind of work that I do, I'm not always that interested in generalization. So it doesn't worry me as much as maybe it worries you. I think sometimes, particularly if there are, maybe you're looking at some slice of a CDP and there's material missing, then I think you have to frame what it is you might know as a result of it. So I've tried to be very careful in this presentation, for example, that this is not average performance. It's a particular data set and what they are saying. So I think particularly bounding your analysis within what you can say and what you can't say is always very wise. So I'd be very careful about that. The other thing is that you might be able to generalize about what people say to the CDP, but that's quite different about generalizing about what do people do. So I think, again, making really clear analytical decisions about what it is you're actually looking at. So for this particular set, we had pretty good coverage of all the questions that we're choosing to look at in this particular analysis. And it's, it's sort of 3 questions among some hundreds. If you know the data set, it's very large. So I think there's also the case that when we have a large data set, we might be drawn to trying to draw out these big overarching observations, and they're really great things to see, but there's also, if you like, deep and particular observations that we can draw from as well. So this is a deep and particular set of observations about the information provided by the leading cohort. So if you like, it's a leading edge, observation study, as opposed to, what is everyone doing. Thereafter, this is where sort of mixed methods and mixed approaches are sort of quite helpful. And so, for example, if I was coming to this, fresh and looked at the 22, I'd be picking some out of those after reading their financial, non-financial information for maybe a case study or a more in-depth analysis of sorts. In some ways, we've started this sample as of interest to me because I'm trying to help these 10 seafood companies sort themselves out. So I'm trying to demonstrate to them that they shouldn't be quite as afraid as what they appear to be, because other people have worked this out, so they must be able to work it out. If they work it out, they may find it's actually really quite important that they have a grip on these risks. So if you like, the purposeful reason as to why I brought the sample together was for a particular set of influence. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I got a very quick following question on this. I know when you were presenting, I was going through this 21 pages to find out which information you are talking about. And I can see you are talking in detail about these 22 companies. But when I'm trying to do it for, say, certain index or like from US or here, even if I take FTSE 100 or FTSE 350, it's really cumbersome. Now, the question is that there are different regulatory requirements in different countries. So, and even industry-wise, like as you are focused on food industry, you are taking those regulations. So industry-wise, we also got a couple of restrictions. And I always find that if I control for those factors in my empirical model, that doesn't going to capture all those differences properly. So do you think that it is how you are tackling, like all the companies are from same industry, but they are not from same country, I believe. So how you capture the regulatory differences then?
I suppose the advantage is that I'm not trying from this. I'm not trying to draw an empirical model. In fact, the fact that you're trying to draw an empirical model from the CDP, what I've seen of it, you have my utmost respect and goodness, that's a really tough job that you're trying to do there.
Yeah.
So for us, and on a slightly different sample that I'm working on with another group of researchers, we're looking at the 100 largest companies that operate on the ocean and therefore will be important for the future of the ocean. And that includes the seafood guys, but also many other companies as well. One of our co-authors has been involved in a study of the regulatory context of all the countries in the world across all of those industries. So somebody has already done that work, and it wasn't a quick piece of work. So again, over time, and this is where being old doesn't have very many advantages, but one of the advantages is that you build up data sets and understandings around an area that allow you to do a bigger and a more encompassing job, that should you wish to reduce these down to factors, you could build a much more sophisticated model. But that takes a study of the regulatory context in all countries across all sectors, and then looking at the company data, and then you can pull together constellations. Sure. But that's a program of work. It's not a paper, and it's I'm trying not to judge from your beauty and your age, but that's not a PhD. Okay.
No, definitely not. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jenna.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I'm just checking. Okay, no, there are no more questions in the chat, but I wanted to go back to what we were discussing with Begonia for a second about analysts or investors actually incorporating this information. In your conversations with the companies or, you know, in your big research plan, is there a point where you're gonna check how investors use this information at all?
For the CBOS, for the CFO cohort, we have a model of who all the investors are. So we know who owns all the companies and how that's changed over time. And there's quite a bit of analysis coming out on some of the edges of science of things like common institutional investors over ecological spaces. So it's if you like doing our kind of work, but coming from a sample set which is entirely differently defined. So there's a bit of work in around that. So we know who all the owners are of our companies. We've had interactions with some of them. For other analysts and investors, they've approached us for data for how they can incorporate into their models more scientific understanding of what's happening with this cohort of firms. They're also keen to be able to offer support to these firms as they make the transition to somewhere different. So of course, the analysts that approach us who know about the work are going to be, you know, the unusual edge of analysts. It's not going to be necessarily the folk who are looking for you know, quick returns, but rather might have a long-term investment interest in seafood and ocean industries. So there's a little bit of that going on. There's also the case, and I think this is where you know, this whole sort of sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is brand new. I think, well, I mean, it might be on all your radar. It wasn't firmly on my radar until relatively recently. I think there's going to be a whole opening up of thinking about how investors provide enough information so individuals can see what they're getting in their investment products of whatever sort. But also I suspect that this process is something about bringing greater literacy to the capital markets. And in a completely different project with Tom Schneider in Canada, we were really interested to see why are we still seeing some of the reserves valuation that you're seeing in fossil fuel companies, given that ultimately you're probably not going to combust those fossil fuels. So again, it's not directly on the balance sheet except insofar as you've capitalized past expenditure, but it's more on the notes to the accounts. And we're just starting to see the leading edge of some companies starting to write those off. So the companies are writing off, and maybe, you know, the stock markets are now starting to recognize that some things they thought were valuable aren't as valuable as they are. So I think it's not that there's suddenly a revelation and everyone gets this, whatever this vision of what's valuable and what's not, because what's valuable and what's not also moves and shapes as the ecology moves and shapes around us, and as the regulation changes as well. So in that respect, I think it's you know, we sometimes think we're going to see a cause and effect more closely than what it is, but I think you know, in itself, that's a hugely interesting question, not one that I've spent a lot of time investigating, but it's something that actually, for which some of the nuance might be coming to the fore now. So it might have been, if you asked that question 5 years ago, the answer is, oh, we don't care. You know, if you ask it now, the question might be different. If you ask it in 5 years' time, it might evolve further still. So I think there's maybe a bit of a movement going on as well.
Thank you, Jen. Bea, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. So I'm sorry, because maybe you explained this. I lost connection for a bit during your presentation. I was wondering to what extent, so because we're discussing users right here, and to what extent are they using it internally? So is this, I saw this morning a news article about how, I think it was Chipotle or something, like a company in the US was building environmental targets into the compensation of the CEO. And so I was wondering if these firms you are dealing with, are they actually using these targets somehow, or a route towards these targets for their KPIs or for employee remunerations in any way? Thank you.
Yes, they are. And I think the interesting thing I saw this week on a news feed I follow called Undercurrent News, which is the seafood news feed. Cargill is going to reduce the carbon intensity of its feeds by 30% in 3 years. So if you like, they've set that target. There will be compensation tied off the back of that. So again, that'll be happening firm by firm. I think if and I appreciate that most people on the call won't have necessarily come across the seafood project that I'm working on. So I'll just say a little bit about it. Is that this is a cohort study. So these are the 10 largest seafood companies on the planet who between them, depending on which fish stocks you look at, mobilize large percentages of ocean protein. In some cases up to 40% of a particular market. Our working hypothesis is that given these 10 companies who are vertically integrated and spread across the globe, if they change, the whole of the industry restructures behind them. So that's our scientific hypothesis. We think that it'll take us 10 to 12 years to know how that plays through. And we're about 5, 6 in at the moment. So our scientific advice to them, and we're not funded by them, we're funded by philanthropic trusts to do the work to contribute to the CEO to CEO initiative. Our work is about them as a cohort. That's really where we're focused. They are poised to start developing, well, they've made a series of commitments just before Christmas as to what they're going to do and deliver by this October. And they're now building their measurement frameworks and the audit assurance and all of those things that you need in order to be able to produce that. Now, whether or not they produce that, it's up to them because it's their job. We try to bring the best possible science and the best possible motivation to them as they proceed down that route. So it's a science business partnership in order to lift their operational game. What it has certainly brought home to me, because I've been working with this cohort of CEOs for about 4 or 5 years now, is not that I was ever particularly cynical. I'm much less cynical than what I used to be. Seeing the inside of a process is always quite interesting. There are no NGOs in this process. If there were any NGOs, they wouldn't talk to us. Okay, so it's a pure, whatever pure means. It's a science to business intersection. So it's quite a particular initiative. It's not a round table. So it hasn't got other stakeholders. They are happy for us as science to engage with other stakeholders and bring their view to them, but they don't want them around the table when the 10 CEOs sit down and make decisions about how ambitious they're going to be. So I've written up the first paper that sort of articulates some of this, and I'm busy trying to write up some of the other papers, because we think there's something really interesting about this Keystone approach. So it's not a bunch of people that are united by particular types of ownership, because some of these are family owned to at least a large percent. They're not united by listing on the particular stock exchange. So they're united by something quite different again, which is almost like a CEO ambition to really transform what they're doing. So, and they're not the only sort of sample set of that sort, because science has sort of picked up this idea, and there's a few of them around. So it's sort of like a different sample all over again, which of course makes it really exciting from a methodological perspective for accountants, who we usually organize our samples in a slightly different way.
Thank you. Torsten?
Oh, I think you might.
I'm sorry, it's me again.
It's all right. Why have we not met? We clearly have lots of things to talk about.
I'd love to in the future. Maybe at the virtual EAA Congress in May, we get a chance, or after that. What you just said about the CEOs wouldn't talk to you if NGOs were involved, that really kind of gave me a jolt. And can you elaborate on that? I'm really interested in the role of NGOs in this whole process of, being something like an information intermediary that has a role to play in translating, from my perspective at least, a role to play in translating transparency regulation into behavioral change in firms, or translating company information into stock prices. So why is there this? What is the CEO's issues with NGOs?
It's at least partly cultural. We've got three Japanese companies in there, and they are the shyest, most reserved, most I'm not going to talk to you kind of group of people you could encounter. So there's some cultural things in there. There's also the case that they represent, and I agree with them in part, but not entirely, that NGOs will have an angle that they're trying to play on them. And somehow they think science hasn't got an angle, which is, it's an interesting perception. I don't think it's a fair or an unfair perception on their behalf. That's not to say that they don't interact with NGOs. And so one of the companies that we work with described to me their annual NGO survey. So they survey all the NGOs that are operating in areas where they feel they might have exposure and risk. And they evaluate which ones they're going to work with in any one year as to sort of like, their perception of reliability, easy to work with or whatever. Some of them they know they will never work with, but they follow their work very, very closely because they know they're the leading edge of excellent. So there seems to be quite a survey nuanced view to which NGOs do you interact with on what basis. Of course, they all interact with NGOs through other governance processes. So if you're catching fish on the high seas, you're within some regional fisheries management organisation. So all the high seas are chopped up, and there's groups that manage them. Those groups are made up of company representatives, NGOs, and country representatives. So there's these sort of multi-stakeholder area-based consortiums are involved in. For this particular initiative, they wanted to really rest on the science. And that's quite interesting because the CEOs of these companies, with the exception of one, all have a science background. So we're also slightly curious as to whether or not it's a particular set of CEOs. Had this been a cohort of telephone companies, I'm sure they wouldn't feel the same about science. Whereas a lot of these folk have been in seafood for a long time and coming at from a scientific perspective, in which case they know and understand and recognize the science team that's coming at them. And I always feel very, I can confess to you guys, because you're like me, I keep on being described as a scientist, and I don't really feel like a scientist. I accept I'm a social scientist, but I'm there with climate modelers. I think it's science, it kind of, but a different kind of science. So it's also, how you might inhabit that identity as a scientist. But I certainly have had to read a lot more science, and I've learned an enormous amount from my proper scientific colleagues on the process as well. And to give you maybe a sense of size, there's a core group of about 20 scientists supporting these companies, and then maybe another 10 to 15 scientists on the broader set. So this is not something that you do on your own time in a wee bit of a thing. It's well funded because of the philanthropic trust's input to it, but it's also a huge multidisciplinary science team gathered around it as well. So it's quite, it's a massive insight for a social scientist like me.
I think you're one of the few accounting researchers that I'm aware of that publish with climate scientists.
Let's all do more in that area.
Thank you.
Cheers.
By the way, just if I may, Joanna, just a second. By the way, you might be interested to hear that for the upcoming EAA online annual conference, we have Johan Rockström as a keynote speaker.
But my science group is from the same place that he used to be.
Right.
Yeah, so it's the same team, the same set of thoughts. Yeah. So enjoy. I mean, Johan's the most amazing science communicator. It's a really good call to have him.
Okay, well, I think we did get to the end of the seminar. So unless there are last minute questions, I think we can thank Jan for her presentation and everybody for being here. And next VARS will be in April, in about 1 month time. We're going to have Martins Messner as our speaker. So I hope to see you all in 1 month or so. Bye.
Isn't it sad there's no drinks reception? There'd be lots of people I'd like to have a wee gossip with on the call.
Well,
they're offered by Giovanna, so.
Yeah. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice
Thank you.
weekend.
Too.
Jerry.
Jen, I'm gonna close this meeting and open up the other one, okay?
Right. Is there the other one a drinks reception then?
It is, you can get yourself a drink for sure.
It's Friday night.
Yeah, I know. I realize it is Friday after all. Yes, I think
I'll
it's
see you
gonna
on the
be,
next one.
it will be socially acceptable to have a drink with you. No worries, okay? I'll see you in a bit. Bye
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.